Jungkook drops to his knees when Jimin says goodbye publicly loudly male. The word asterisk goodbye hit the microphone before it hit Jungkook's heart, sharp and metallic, echoing across the stadium as Jimin's voice trembled and the lights froze mid-sweep. And in that suspended second, Jungkook's knees gave out and the world fell with him. The stage smelled of hot metal and rain-soaked cables, the kind of smell that comes after tears you didn't know you were holding. Cameras screamed red, fans gasped like a single lung losing air, and Jungkook stared up at Jimin from the floor as if gravity had betrayed him personally. Jimin stood still, hands clenched at his sides, jaw tight, eyes shining with a resolve that looked painfully rehearsed. "I'm saying this here," Jimin said, breath cracking, "because it's the only place I'm brave enough." Jungkook tried to stand. His legs refused. His palms pressed into the cold stage, skin burning, heart thudding so loud it drowned the crowd. He knew this tone. He knew the way Jimin's shoulders squared when he was about to choose pain over honesty. What Jungkook didn't know, what terrified him, was asterisk why. The cheers turned into whispers, then into a low, anxious hum. Somewhere a fan cried. Somewhere else a staff member froze, headset slipping. Jungkook tasted salt and iron and swallowed, eyes locked on Jimin like a lifeline he was about to lose. "Don't," Jungkook whispered, though he knew Jimin couldn't hear him. Jimin inhaled, slow and deliberate, the way he did before difficult choreography, the way he did before telling the truth. "I can't keep pretending," he said. "Not for you, not for them, not for myself." A memory sliced through Jungkook. Late nights in the studio, Jimin barefoot on the cold floor, humming melodies to calm his shaking hands, the way Jimin avoided mirrors on bad days, the ring he once wore and then stopped wearing without explanation. Jungkook had noticed everything. He had said nothing. Silence had become his habit, his shield, his sin. The screen behind them flared with abstract light, turning Jimin into a silhouette edged in gold. "This is my goodbye," Jimin said softly, "to the version of us that keeps hurting." Jungkook pushed up at last, shaking, the crowd blurring. "Jimin," his voice broke into pieces he couldn't gather. "Please, not like this." Jimin looked down and for a heartbeat the mask cracked. Fear flashed there. Love, too. Then the mask slid back into place. "I'm sorry," he said, and the apology sounded old, worn thin from too much use. Jungkook dropped again, this time on purpose, the impact jarring through his bones. He bowed his head, not in defeat but in grief, because he understood now. Jimin wasn't leaving him. Jimin was leaving the lie they had built together. As security moved and managers shouted, Jungkook's mind raced backward, reconstructing the fractures he'd ignored. The anonymous threats that arrived after certain performances, the article drafts that never published, the way Jimin flinched at sudden flashes. Jungkook had told himself love was enough to protect them. He had been wrong. Jimin stepped closer, careful, as if approaching a wild animal. "I needed you to hear it," he murmured, off mic now, just for Jungkook. "I needed you to stop saving me by disappearing yourself." Jungkook looked up, eyes red, breath uneven. His fear wasn't of loss, it was of understanding too late. "I thought staying quiet was keeping you safe," he said. "It was keeping you numb," Jimin replied, voice gentle and devastating. The crowd roared as if on cue, the moment already mutating into legend, into headlines and edits and theories. Jungkook stood, swaying, and reached out. Jimin took his hand, fingers warm, grounding. The touch was brief, electric, enough to remind Jungkook of everything they'd been and everything they still could be if courage outweighed habit. Jimin turned back to the microphone one last time. "This isn't the end," he said, choosing each word like a promise carved into stone. "It's a beginning I'm finally ready to face." When the lights cut and the stage fell into darkness, Jungkook remained standing, hand empty, chest burning, a resolve taking shape beneath the pain. He understood now that love wasn't kneeling in silence. Love was standing up to the truth, even when it broke you open. The hallway behind the stage smelled of disinfectant and sweat, a sharp, sterile contrast to the storm of sound still raging beyond the walls, and Jungkook followed Jimin without thinking, his footsteps uneven, his heartbeat louder than the distant chanting of their names. "Why here?" Jungkook finally demanded, his voice cracking as the door slammed shut behind them. "Why in front of everyone?" Jimin spun around, eyes blazing, the controlled calm from the stage dissolving into something raw and dangerous. "Because you never listen when it's quiet," he shot back. "Because when I whisper, you disappear." "That's not fair," Jungkook said, raking a hand through his hair, fingers trembling. "You know what I was protecting you from." Jimin laughed, short and bitter. "From the world, or from your own fear?" The words landed hard. Jungkook felt them lodge somewhere deep in his chest. "You think this was easy for me," he snapped. "Watching you fall apart at night and smile in the morning, signing agreements that erased parts of us like they were mistakes." Jimin stepped closer, close enough that Jungkook could smell his cologne, familiar and painfully comforting. "I didn't ask you to erase yourself," Jimin said quietly. "I asked you to stand with me." Silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. Outside, the crowd roared again, oblivious to the fracture widening behind the scenes. Jungkook remembered the first time Jimin had confessed his fear, voice shaking in the dark dorm room, admitting he felt like he was vanishing piece by piece. Jungkook had held him then, promised to be strong enough for both of them. Somewhere along the way, strength had turned into avoidance. "I thought if I carried it alone, you wouldn't break," Jungkook said, voice low. "I didn't realize I was breaking you anyway." Jimin's eyes softened, but his jaw stayed set. "And what about me?" he asked. "What about the nights I waited for you to say we'd fight it together, and you never did?" The door creaked open slightly as a manager's voice called out, tense and urgent. Jimin raised a hand without looking, shutting it again. "Not now," he said, and the authority in his tone was absolute. Jungkook swallowed. "Is this really goodbye?" he asked, the question heavy with everything he was afraid to hear. Jimin exhaled slowly, shoulders sagging at last. "It's goodbye to hiding," he said. "Goodbye to pretending I'm okay while you bleed in silence. I needed the world to hear it because I needed you to believe me." Jungkook stepped forward, fists clenched. "Then let me be loud," he said, voice rising. "Let me mess it up. Let me stand there with you, and take whatever comes." Jimin studied him, searching his face like he was looking for proof. "Words are easy now," he said. "Where were they when the rumors started? When I asked if we could say something, anything, and you told me to wait?" "I was scared," Jungkook admitted. "Scared they'd tear you apart, scared they'd take everything from us." "They already did," Jimin replied, pain flashing across his features. "And you still chose silence." The accusation hung between them, undeniable. Jungkook felt the weight of it, felt the truth sink into his bones. He nodded slowly. "Then let me choose differently," he said. "Even if it's too late for the stage, don't let it be too late for us." Jimin's breath hitched. For a moment, the mask fell completely, revealing exhaustion, longing, and a fragile hope he had tried so hard to bury. "I don't know if I can trust that yet," he said. "I don't know if love is enough without courage." Jungkook reached out, stopping just short of touching him. "Then teach me," he said softly. "I'll learn, I swear." The noise outside began to fade as the concert moved on, the world resuming its rhythm without them. Jimin turned toward the mirror on the wall, studying his own reflection like a stranger. "This doesn't end tonight," he said. "It starts something harder." Jungkook nodded, tears threatening again but his voice steady. "Harder doesn't scare me anymore." Jimin finally looked back at him, a small, weary smile breaking through the tension. "Good," he said, "because walking away would have been easier." They stood there, not touching, not leaving, suspended in the aftermath of truth spoken too late and too loud, both knowing that whatever came next would demand more honesty than either had ever given before. The dressing room door clicked shut, mooting the outside world, and the sudden quiet felt louder than the stadium ever had, pressing against Jungkook's ears until his thoughts rang. Jimin dropped into the chair in front of the mirror, hands shaking as he reached for a water bottle and failed to open it on the first try. Jungkook moved instinctively, twisting the cap loose, then hesitated before handing it over, as if even that small kindness needed permission now. You always do that, Jimin said without looking at him, voice hoarse. You step in before I ask. And you always pretend you don't need it, Jungkook replied, the edge in his tone sharper than he intended. Jimin finally met his eyes through the reflection. Because every time I did, it came with silence later. The word stung. Jungkook leaned against the counter, knuckles white. You think I don't know what they threatened us with? He said. You think I didn't read every clause, every warning, every line about consequences? Then why did you agree? Jimin shot back. Why did you look me in the eye and say waiting was the right thing? Because I was told you'd be protected if we stayed quiet, Jungkook said, voice rising. Because they said your career would survive, that the backlash would fade. Jimin let out a hollow laugh. Protected, he echoed. I was monitored, controlled, watched. I couldn't even breathe without wondering who was listening. Jungkook's chest tightened. I didn't know it was that bad. You didn't ask, Jimin said, finally standing, anger radiating off him like heat. You saw the cracks and chose not to look too close. The mirror caught them facing each other now, two reflections fractured by light and shadow. Jungkook stepped closer. I was wrong, he said, but don't pretend you didn't push me away too. You shut me out. Because every time I tried to open up, you'd go quiet, Jimin replied. You'd hold me and say nothing, like love without words could fix everything. Jungkook swallowed hard. I thought holding you was enough. It wasn't, Jimin said, tears finally spilling. Not when I needed you to fight. The room smelled faintly of makeup remover and sweat, a reminder of performances layered over pain. Jungkook reached out at last, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid that if I spoke, I'd lose you faster. Jimin's shoulders sagged, the anger giving way to exhaustion. I was afraid that if you didn't speak, I'd lose myself, he said softly. They stood there, breathing unevenly, the truth settling between them like a fragile truce. Jungkook took a step closer, slow, deliberate. I can't undo what I didn't say, he said, but I can decide what I say next. Jimin searched his face, skepticism and hope warring in his eyes. And what would that be? Jungkook met his gaze without flinching. That I'm done hiding behind silence, he said. That if you stand alone again, it won't be because I chose comfort over you. The words hung heavy, controversial even in the privacy of the room. Jimin's breath hitched. You know what that could cost us, he said. I know, Jungkook replied, and I know what it's already cost you. A knock sounded at the door, sharp and impatient. A voice called out, tense, warning them about statements, schedules, damage control. Jimin closed his eyes, pain flickering across his face. Jungkook moved before thinking, placing himself between Jimin and the door. Give us 5 minutes, Jungkook called out, his tone firm, unyielding. The footsteps retreated. Jimin opened his eyes slowly. You didn't hesitate, he said, surprised. Jungkook turned back to him. I'm tired of hesitating, he replied. For a moment, Jimin looked like he might break again. Then he stepped forward and pressed his forehead against Jungkook's shoulder, the contact tentative but real. Jungkook froze, then wrapped his arms around him, not shielding, not hiding, just holding him where anyone could walk in and see. This doesn't fix everything, Jimin murmured. I know, Jungkook said, but it's honest. Jimin pulled back just enough to look at him. If we do this, he said, voice steady now, there's no half steps, no disappearing when it gets ugly. Jungkook nodded, eyes burning. I won't run. Outside, the world was already rewriting what had happened on stage, turning pain into spectacle. Inside the small room, two people stood amid the wreckage of what they hadn't said, choosing, finally, to face the fallout together. Not as a secret, not as a performance, but as something real, fragile, and fiercely alive. The conference room lights were too bright, washing the color from everyone's faces, and Jungkook felt exposed the moment he stepped inside with Jimin at his side, hands brushing but not quite holding, as if the space itself demanded distance. Executives sat in a row like a jury, tablets glowing, expressions carved into practiced neutrality. The air smelled of coffee gone cold and anxiety. Jimin straightened his spine, chin lifted, the same posture he used before stepping on stage, but Jungkook could feel the tremor beneath it. "We need to talk about what just happened," one of them said, voice smooth and controlled. "Public statements, damage containment." Jimin didn't sit. "It wasn't damage," he said calmly. "It was the truth." A murmur rippled across the table. Jungkook's pulse spiked. He stepped forward before anyone could respond. "If you're going to frame it as a mistake," he said, "start by calling it what it was, honest." A senior manager sighed. "Honesty doesn't trend well when it disrupts contracts." Jimin laughed quietly, the sound sharp. "My mental health disrupted those contracts long before tonight." Silence dropped, heavy and uncomfortable. Jungkook watched one executive glance away, guilt flickering like a crack in glass. He leaned closer to Jimin, lowering his voice. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. "I know," Jimin replied, not looking at him, but the steadiness in his tone felt new. They were told about consequences, about optics, about fans and sponsors and carefully curated narratives. Each word felt like a hand pressing down. Jungkook listened, jaw tight, until something in him snapped loose. "You warned us about backlash," he said, voice firm. "You never warned us about what silence would do to him." Jimin finally turned, eyes shining. "Or to us." The room shifted. The conversation grew sharper, louder, words colliding like sparks. Jimin spoke about nights he couldn't sleep, about panic masked by smiles, about feeling erased by decisions made for him. Jungkook admitted his fear, his compliance, the way he'd convinced himself that protecting Jimin meant mooting himself. "This isn't a rebellion," Jungkook said. "It's accountability." One executive leaned back, studying them. "If you go forward together like this," he said slowly, "there's no undoing it." Jimin exhaled. "Good." When the meeting finally ended, the hallway felt cooler, quieter, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Jungkook and Jimin walked side by side, the adrenaline fatting into something heavier. "I didn't know you'd say all that," Jimin admitted, stopping near a window overlooking the city lights. Jungkook met his gaze. "I didn't know I could," he said, "but I couldn't watch you be reduced to a headline again." Jimin's expression softened, vulnerability seeping through the cracks. "I was ready to walk away tonight," he confessed. "From everything from you." Jungkook's chest tightened. "And now?" Jimin hesitated, then reached out, finally lacing their fingers together. "Now I'm scared," he said honestly, "but I'm not alone." They stood there, hands joined, watching the city pulse below them, knowing the fallout would be loud and messy and public. Yet for the first time in a long while, Jungkook felt grounded, not kneeling, not hiding, but standing beside the person he loved with his eyes open. Whatever came next wouldn't be easy, but it would be real, and that truth, hard and burning, felt like the beginning of something neither of them was willing to let go of again. Morning crept in without mercy, pale and intrusive, bleeding through the hotel curtains, and exposing the aftermath of a night that had already rewritten everything. Jungkook sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, phone vibrating endlessly in his hand, the screen lighting up with headlines he couldn't bring himself to open. Jimin stood by the window, arms crossed, watching the city wake up as if daring it to look back at him. "They're calling it a meltdown," Jungkook said finally, voice flat. "A stunt, a crisis." Jimin didn't turn around. "Of course they are," he replied. "It's easier than admitting I meant every word." Jungkook rose and crossed the room, stopping a few steps behind him. "You didn't say goodbye to me," he said quietly. "You said goodbye to a cage." Jimin's reflection in the glass flinched. "And cages don't open politely," he said. "They break loudly." A knock at the door shattered the stillness. This time it wasn't management, it was a familiar voice, strained, cautious. One of the members stepped in, eyes flicking between them, concern etched deep. "The internet is on fire," he said. "Fans are fighting, some are worried, some are furious." Jimin let out a slow breath. "I knew this would happen." "But they're also listening," the member added. "Really listening." The words lingered. Jungkook felt something shift, fragile but powerful. "We can't undo it," he said. so we decide what it becomes. Later that afternoon, the room filled again, this time with tension thick enough to taste. Statements were drafted and redrafted, each version softer than the last, each revision sanding down the truth until it barely resembled what Jimin had bared on stage. Jungkook watched Jimin's shoulders tense with every compromise suggested. "No," Jimin said suddenly, pushing the paper away. His voice didn't shake. "I won't apologize for surviving." A stunned silence followed. An executive tried to interject, but Jungkook spoke first. "If you want a statement," he said, "it won't erase him, it won't erase us." The wordus landed like a dropped glass. Eyes turned, whispers sparked. Jimin looked at Jungkook, surprise and fear colliding in his gaze. "You don't have to do that," he murmured. "I do," Jungkook replied. "I'm done watching you stand alone." The statement that finally went out was imperfect, raw around the edges, impossible to fully control. It didn't deny the pain or dress it up. It acknowledged it. And when it was released, the backlash came fast: anger, speculation, betrayal. But so did something else. Messages of understanding. Stories shared by fans who saw themselves in Jimin's trembling voice, in Jungkook's knees hitting the stage. That night, when the noise finally dulled into a distant roar, Jungkook found Jimin on the balcony, knees drawn to his chest, staring at the dark sky. "I don't feel brave," Jimin admitted. "I feel exposed." Jungkook sat beside him, shoulder brushing his. "Bravery isn't comfort," he said. "It's staying." Jimin leaned his head against Jungkook's shoulder, the weight of it grounding. "I was so ready to leave," he whispered. "I thought loving you meant disappearing." "And I thought loving you meant silence," Jungkook replied. "We were both wrong." They sat there for a long time, listening to the city breathe, the future uncertain but no longer unspoken. Jimin straightened at last. Eyes clear despite the exhaustion. "If we keep going," he said, "we do it honest, even when it hurts." Jungkook nodded, taking his hand without hesitation. "Especially then." The night didn't offer answers or absolution, but it offered something rarer: truth shared without apology. And in that fragile, defiant quiet, Jungkook understood that what had begun with a public goodbye was no longer about endings at all, but about learning how to remain without losing themselves again. The rehearsal studio was colder than usual, air conditioning humming like a warning, and Jungkook felt it seep into his bones as he watched Jimin stretch in silence, every movement precise, controlled, a little too sharp for someone who claimed he was fine. "You're pushing too hard," Jungkook said, breaking the quiet. Jimin didn't look at him. "If I stop moving, I'll start thinking." "That's not strength," Jungkook replied, frustration slipping into his voice. "That's punishment." Jimin straightened, finally turning, eyes flashing. "Don't analyze me like I'm a problem you need to solve." "I'm not," Jungkook said quickly. "I'm scared." The word landed between them, heavy and exposed. Jimin's expression shifted, anger flickering into something softer, then hardening again. "You weren't scared when you stayed quiet," he said. "You were comfortable." Jungkook flinched. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Jimin challenged, stepping closer. "You knew how much it hurt me. You still chose the easier road." Jungkook's chest tightened. "It wasn't easy," he said, voice rising. "Every day I watched you fade and told myself I was doing the right thing. Do you know how much I hate myself for that?" The room vibrated with unspoken history. Mirrors reflected two versions of them, one guarded, one unraveling. Jimin's breath hitched, but he didn't back down. "Hating yourself doesn't heal me," he said. "It doesn't undo the nights I felt invisible next to you." Jungkook took a step forward, hands shaking. "Then tell me how to make it right," he said. "Yell at me, break something, just don't shut me out." Jimin laughed, sharp and broken. "You think I haven't tried," he said. "I swallowed it because every time I opened my mouth I saw fear in your eyes. I didn't want to be the reason you lost everything." Jungkook's voice dropped to a whisper. "You were never the reason." Silence stretched, thick and painful. Jimin's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. "I don't know how to trust that," he admitted. "Not after years of proving myself disposable." Jungkook reached out, then stopped, letting his hand fall. Then don't trust words, he said. Trust what I do next. Before Jimin could respond, the studio door opened and another voice cut in, tense and urgent, bringing news of sponsors pulling back, schedules shifting, pressure mounting. The room filled with noise again, the reality of consequences crashing down. Jimin closed his eyes, jaw tightening. Here it is, he murmured. The price. Jungkook surprised himself by laughing softly, bitter but resolute. No, he said. This is just proof we were never as safe as we pretended. Everyone left eventually, the studio emptying until it was just the two of them again, echoes of music still lingering in the walls. Jimin sat on the floor, back against the mirror, exhaustion finally claiming him. I'm tired, he said quietly, of being strong, of explaining myself. Jungkook sank down beside him, close enough to feel his warmth. Then don't, he said. Let me carry it for a while. Jimin turned his head, eyes red but steady. You can't carry me forever. I don't want to, Jungkook replied. I want to walk with you. Jimin studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He leaned his head against Jungkook's shoulder, the contact tentative but real, and for the first time since the stage lights went dark, his body relaxed. Outside, the world argued and judged and speculated, but inside the quiet studio, two people sat amid cracked reflections, no longer pretending they were unbreakable, choosing instead to be honest, even when it hurt, even when it changed everything. The final performance came without spectacle, without surprise announcements or dramatic lighting cues, just two figures walking onto the stage side by side, while the crowd held its breath, sensing that this moment mattered in a way no script could manufacture. Jungkook felt the familiar heat of the lights, but this time his knees stayed steady. He glanced at Jimin, who met his eyes openly, no mask, no practiced smile, only quiet resolve. The music began softly, almost tentative, and when Jimin sang, his voice carried not pain alone but survival, textured with everything he had endured and chosen not to hide anymore. Jungkook joined in, his voice firm, grounding, no longer chasing perfection but truth. They didn't perform at each other, they performed with each other, sharing glances that spoke of nights spent arguing, breaking, forgiving, and rebuilding. The audience felt it, the way silence fell between verses, the way cheers rose not from shock but recognition. Mid-song, Jimin reached for Jungkook's hand. It was simple, unannounced, irreversible. The stadium erupted, but neither of them flinched. Jungkook tightened his grip, not as a shield, not as an apology, but as a promise kept in real time. When the last note faded, Jimin stepped forward, breath uneven but eyes clear. I once said goodbye here, he said softly. Not because I stopped loving, but because I needed to start living. Jungkook stood beside him. And I learned that loving someone out loud is worth the risk, he added, voice steady. Silence isn't safety, honesty is. There were no bows heavy with regret, no dramatic exits. Just two people standing in the aftermath of their truth, allowing the noise, the judgment, the love, and the uncertainty to exist without running from it. Later, far from cameras and crowds, they sat together in a quiet room, the city lights dim beyond the window. Jimin leaned back, exhausted but lighter, and Jungkook rested beside him, their shoulders touching. We didn't lose everything, Jimin said quietly. No, Jungkook replied. We lost the lie. Jimin smiled then, small but real, and closed his eyes. For the first time in a long while, goodbye no longer echoed like an ending. It sounded like the last word of a chapter they had finally finished telling honestly, leaving behind not emptiness, but space to breathe, to heal, and to remain together without kneeling, without hiding, and without fear.